Hello, friends. Good afternoon. Today, let us discuss something different from our Puranas, Itihasas, Granth, Vedas, Upanishads, and all the literature, scriptures that we feel proud of. Today, let me share with you 7 ugly truths about India that nobody wants to admit. A hard look at 7 cultural and systemic failures shaping modern India, from pollution and unsafe cities to corruption, gender inequality, and mass poverty. Beneath the rapid growth and global ambitions, basic institutions and public trust are eroding, if not already depleted. Exploring how environmental decay, weak governance, and social divides could undermine long term stability and prosperity. I am sharing some of the views from abroad about our country, lest we think that winning in elections as the only agenda and its stage managed celebrations as the only goal before India. Let us think twice. These are views of Indians living abroad as well as foreigners looking at us from there. Corruption and deceitfulness is the chain around every Indian. A tea seller becomes a PM. This flies in the face of pervading pessimism about social transformation, social stratification, drenched in this narrative. What about public defecating? The rotting corpse in the Ganges rivers during Kumbh Mela. We here in the US, they say, have many judges, and I'm willing to send some to India if we don't know to impart justice for offenses committed. America is bloated with excess judication. These liberal judges will be perfect for India, especially the appellate system. Send them all. India needs help. The judges get to see the world as it really is. America gets liberated, a win for all. India can land on the moon, but it still can't fix a pothole without 5 stamps and 3 middlemen. It's not just bureaucracy, not just poverty. It's something deeper, more invincible, incorrigible. A habit so old, it feels like common sense. A culture of unchallengeable hierarchy, one that protects incompetence, rewards connections, and punishes questioning. And it's not just slowing India down, if not already done. It's quietly setting the stage for something far more dangerous. Today, we'll break down how this invisible force is weakening every part of the Indian system, from courts and schools to infrastructure, innovation, even justice itself. And why? If it's not confronted soon, it won't just stall India's rise, it could cause its collapse. We are already seeing it. Think about the contradiction for a second. This is a country that runs elections on a scale no other democracy has ever attempted, over 1 billion voters. A country with nuclear weapons, a space program that rivals NASA's precision, and a tech sector that powers half the world's back end software. India has all the tools of a modern superpower, and yet roads take years to finish. Courts take decades to deliver a verdict. Basic government services require a maze of connections just to function. Islands of world class excellence, surrounded by an ocean of institutional dysfunction. Why? The easy answers are tempting. poverty, colonial legacy, overpopulation. And sure, those are real. But they don't explain why some sectors operate at global standards while ordinary citizens still can't get a building permit without a bribe. They don't explain why countries that start in worse positions reform faster. Now, here's the thing most people get wrong. They hear hierarchy and they shrug. Every country has hierarchy. America has Wall Street billionaires. Japan has rigid corporate ranks. Britain still has a literal monarchy sitting on a golden throne. So, what makes India different? It's not that hierarchy exists, it's what happens when it goes wrong. In most cities, hierarchy is accepted but contestable. A bad boss gets fired. A corrupt official gets investigated. A failing system gets challenged by citizens, courts, unions, or the press. Authority is respected, sure, but it's also held accountable. There's a feedback loop. Power has to justify itself. In India, for thousands of years, hierarchy has operated on a fundamentally different principle. It hasn't been a practical arrangement for organizing society. It's been treated as a moral structure, a cosmic order that should not be disturbed, a heavenly proclamation, non biological. And that single difference changes absolutely everything. Because when authority is respected more than competence, incompetent systems survive far longer than they should. When status is treated as destiny rather than function, entire pools of human talent go waste. When loyalty to the inner circle is treated as the highest virtue, public institutions can never become truly impartial. When power is personal rather than institutional, law becomes negotiable. And when suffering is framed as meaningful, even deserved, endurances replace rebellion. That's when society goes silent. That's one small thing, not hierarchy itself, but hierarchy that cannot be questioned. Hierarchy that is treated as sacred rather than practical. And what it does to a country, quietly, over decades, even just 11 years is enough. It is devastating. They say, don't take our word for it. Let's trace the roots. Because this isn't some recent political failure or policy mistake. This operating system has been running for over 3,000 years and it's still running today. Around 1500 BC, one of humanity's oldest religious texts, the Rig Veda, introduced a creation story that would shape Indian civilization for millennia to come. This is the interpretation of the West, how they look at it, however much we pride on our Vedas and Shastras. The Purusha Sukta described a primordial cosmic being whose body was divided to create the social order. From his mouth came the priests, from his arms the warriors, from his thighs the merchants, from his feet the servants. Scholar Paul Moose has called this passage essentially the first constitution of India. The foundational moment when social rank stopped being a human invention up for debate and became divine architecture. Cosmic truth, unchallengeable by design. And over the centuries, the cosmic ordering didn't just survive, it hardened. Genetic research led by Harvard's David Reich has shown that roughly 2 to 4,000 years ago, the mixing between Indian population groups dramatically slowed and strict endogamy took hold. Communities sealed themselves off. Marriage stayed within caste. Bloodlines stayed separate. And the walls between social groups became not just cultural but biological. How deep does these walls go? Here's a number that tells us the story, the whole story. As of 2011, intercaste marriage in India sat at just about 5.8%. Some more recent estimates push it to about 10%. But even that is strikingly low. In a country of over 1.4 billion people, roughly 9 out of every 10 marriages still happen within caste lines. A 2020 Pew Research survey found that 64% of Hindu respondents were still opposed to women in their community marrying outside their caste. Thousands of years later, the walls are still standing. And the consequences goes far beyond who marries whom. Because here's what a locked-in hierarchy really does to a nation. It turns the state itself into a fortress of unchallenged power. And that brings us to what might be the most visible symptom of this disease. India's legendary bureaucrat anthropologist Akhil Gupta spent years embedded in the Indian government offices studying how ordinary citizens interact with their own state. What he documented in his research wasn't just inefficiency or underfunding, it was something more structural, more ingrained. Paper became power, procedure became sacred, delay became the system's default setting. आज नहीं तो कल नहीं तो परसों. And the citizen became not a rights bearing equal but a supplicant, someone navigating a labyrinth of signatures, stamps, fees, and middlemen just to access the most basic public services. It took 2 years for me to get my address changed on Aadhaar card. This is a lived reality for hundreds of millions of people, waiting for permits that sit on desks for months, waiting for land transfers that take years, waiting for decisions that never come because no official wants the responsibility of making one. And the reason? It just isn't laziness or bureaucratic culture. It's that the system is constructed around a principle where authority is protected more fiercely than outcomes. In democratic theory, every citizen is supposed to stand as an equal before the state. In reality, millions of Indians encounter their government through lower level offices where unspoken hierarchy dictates what can be demanded, how loudly you can speak, and whether you are even allowed to push back at all. The result is a state that looks powerful from a distance. Nuclear weapons, space missions, the world's largest democratic elections, but feels fragile and unreliable at ground level. Roads that take years to build. Schools where teachers simply don't show up. There are no students, they are empty. Some of the laboratories look like specimens from Mohenjo-daro. A gap between ambition and execution so wide that it defies daily life for a billion people. And if you think that's the worst of it, wait until you hear what's happening inside India's courts. Besides, the justice system isn't just slow, it's collapsing under its own weight. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. As of January 2026, India has more than 54 million pending court cases. 54 million. That number has doubled in the past decade alone. More than a million of those cases have been dragging on for over 10 years. And here's a figure that should make everyone's blood run cold. Over 180,000 cases have been sitting unresolved for more than 30 years. In April 2022, a court in the state of Bihar finally acquitted a man of murder charges after he had already spent 28 years rotting in prison. The country's oldest pending case, a bank liquidation lawsuit, originally filed in November 1948, was closed in early 2023. And not because it was finally resolved, because nobody even bothered to show up for the hearing anymore. The World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index now ranks India 114th out of 143 countries on civil justice and 89th on criminal justice. One of the world's largest democracies, a nation that built its identity on constitutional governance, performing worse than countries with a fraction of its resources, its population, or its ambitions. And the bleeding isn't stopping. The Indian government itself told Parliament that court pendency rose by nearly 6% in just 3 years. Pendency in the Supreme Court alone jumped over 11%. The country has only about 21 judges for every million citizens. The United States, around 150. At current disposal rates, experts estimate it would take several hundred years to clear the existing backlog. Several hundred years. That's not a justice system. That's a monument to institutional failure. And the government's response? It told Parliament that case disposal is the judiciary's problem, not theirs. But here's what nobody talks about. Delay isn't just inefficiency in India. Delay is hierarchy, wearing a different mask. Those with money, connections, and status can afford to wait. Hiring lawyers, filing appeals, dragging proceedings out across decades. Those without, the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless, they give up. They walk away. They stop expecting justice entirely. And when citizens stop expecting justice, something fundamental breaks. Because that erosion of trust doesn't stay inside the courtroom. It spreads like rust through every institution. And it pushes people towards the only thing left: loyalty to the tribe. When the state fails to protect you, you turn inward. You rely on family, on caste networks, on personal connections and patronage. In India, that instinct isn't weakness, it's a survival strategy, refined over generations. When public institutions are unreliable, kinship networks pick up the slack. Chacha Bhatija. They provide welfare, economic support, and political protection. But there's a tipping point where loyalty becomes a replacement for law. And India crossed that long time ago. When public services become scarce or unpredictable, the rational response is to secure access through connections, through caste, faction, favors. Over time, nepotism stops feeling like corruption. It becomes the new normal. Not new, now it's enough old, 75 years old. It starts feeling like a moral duty. Helping your own becomes the highest virtue. And anyone who refuses to play that game, who insists on working within the rules, gets treated as naive at the best, disloyal at worst. The result? Law becomes something you access through networks, not rights. Officials who refuse to favor their community get punished socially. Citizens who try to work through proper channels get left behind. The very idea of impartiality begins to feel foreign, idealistic, and impractical. And the inequality this produces has reached levels that would shock most people. Research from the World Inequality Lab, led by economists including Thomas Piketty, found that by 2022 to 2023, India's top 1% controlled 22.6% of national income and a staggering 40.1% of the nationals' total wealth. Those are the highest levels in India's entire recorded history. And the game doesn't seem to respite. Every few days, you can see the millions being made on hiked stock prices, known only to the few. The research coined a term for it: the billionaire Raj. And their conclusion was devastating. Today's India is more unequal than it was under the British colonial rule. The numbers keep piling up. India now has over 9,17,000 dollar millionaires, with 39,000 added in 2024 alone. But in that same year, average wealth per adult actually declined in real terms. The UBS Global Wealth Report 2025 ranks India amongst the 10 most unequal countries on Earth, planet Earth, as unequal as the United States, but without any of the safety nets. Wealth is being created, but only at the very top. For most Indians, the ladder isn't being climbed, it's being pulled away. And this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is what happens when a system allocates opportunity based on who you are rather than what you can do. When large sections of a population face barriers to education, to professional networks, to capital, the entire nation pays the price. Firms lose talent they never knew existed. Institutions lose legitimacy they need to function. And society fragments into competing status groups rather than integrating into shared citizenship. And this hierarchy doesn't stay within India's borders. In February 2023, the city of Seattle formally added caste as a protected category in its anti discrimination law. So, this is what, when we Indians go abroad and settle down, we influence even the caste system there. It travels, it persists even across nations. But there's one more layer to this, and it's the most uncomfortable one to talk about. Because hierarchy in India isn't only enforced by institutions and social pressures, it's reinforced by something far more personal: belief itself, belief system. Now, let's be clear. India's religious and philosophical traditions are among the deepest and most sophisticated in human history. They contain profound moral insight, rich traditions of reform, and powerful internal critique. This is not an attack on anyone's faith, but within those traditions, certain ideas have been recruited, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously, to stabilize the very hierarchy we have been describing. When suffering is framed as karma, as a moral consequence of actions in a past life, the psychological pressure to fight injustice becomes weakened. Today, it's at its weakest when all atrocities, injustices in the election process is celebrated as victory. If your misfortune feels deserved, outrage gives way to quiet acceptance. If the social order feels cosmic, challenging it feels dangerous. If duty to your station is sacred, rebellion starts to feel like sin. B.R. Ambedkar, the towering intellect who drafted the India's constitution and who himself was born into a socially called untouchable Dalit community, saw this with piercing clarity. He argued that the caste system survived not through economic pressures or power or political force alone, but through a spiritual architecture that made inequality feel natural, inevitable, even holy. His landmark work, Annihilation of Caste, remains one of the most powerful internal critiques any civilization has produced against its own foundations. A proof that India has always contained voices demanding change, even as the system worked to silence them. The most revealing consequence of the spiritual anchoring, a shift in the emotional posture across an entire civilization. Endurance replaces rebellion. A society can endure hardship for a remarkably long time, no doubt. Endurance can even be mistaken for strength. But endurance has a dark side. When the denial of dignity becomes normal and reform keeps getting deferred, the cost accumulates invisibly until the whole system turns brittle to the point of breaking down. So here's the question that cuts the heart of everything. If every society has hierarchy, why does India's version threaten collapse while others produce progress? The answer is quite counterweights. Counterweights. Japan is famously hierarchical, but its post-war bureaucracy linked authority directly to performance and institutional discipline. Promotions rewarded competence. Organizations demanded measurable results. The state drove industrial policy with a level of coordination that transformed a devastated nation into an economic superpower within a generation. Hierarchy served a function, and that function was accountable delivery. South Korea is brutally hierarchical, but its social pressure channeled it into relentless competition through education spending that ranks among the highest in the world, through industry that demanded constant improvement, through a national ambition that treated stagnation as failure. The human cost was enormous: stress, inequality, a collapsing birth rate. But the system didn't teach people to endure their station. It taught them to fight their way out of it. Western democracies, hierarchy coexists with a deeply rooted culture of challenge. Citizens contest authority through courts, media, unions, and street protest. The result is often messy and sometimes outright chaotic. But the chaos contains something crucial: a self correcting mechanism. The power must constantly justify this position or lose it. Hierarchy balanced by accountability produces progress. Hierarchy without accountability produces decay. And India is running out of time to decide which one it chooses. I think by now it has already made the choice across the country, by hook or by crook. Because the world it's entering does not wait for societies to get their institutions in order. In 2022 alone, more than 1.7 million Indians died from exposure to air pollution, a 38% increase from just a decade earlier. The economic cost of those premature deaths was estimated at $339 billion, equivalent to 9.5% of India's entire GDP, wiped out by a single systems problem that demands exactly that kind of institutional coordination that unchallengeable hierarchy makes nearly impossible. Climate stress is intensifying. In 2024, Indians face 50% more heat waves days than average, resulting in an estimated $194 billion in lost labor productivity. Workers lost roughly 419 hours of labor per person that year, 124% more than in the 1990s. Water scarcity is worsening across major agricultural regions. The area of Indian land experienced extreme drought has surged 138% compared to the 1950s. Infrastructure is crumbling, not from lack of money, but from lack of accountability in how that money gets spent. These aren't problems one brilliant engineer or one bold prime minister can solve alone. Air pollution isn't an individual failure. Court backlogs aren't a single judge's fault. Crumbling roads aren't one contractor's corruption. These are system problems. And system problems demand exactly what unchallengeable hierarchy destroys: honest feedback. Rapid correction, and the ability for ordinary people to stand up and say, this is unacceptable, without fear. The real question facing India isn't whether it can change its culture overnight. Cultures don't change by command. Civilizations don't abandon 3,000-year-old habits because someone writes a new policy. The real question is whether India can build counterweights, institutions strong enough to hold the hierarchy accountable, and social norms brave enough to make challenging power feel legitimate rather than terrifying. Because if unchallengeable hierarchy remains the default, if the habit of tolerating dysfunction continues to shape every courtroom, every government office, every classroom, every workplace, the pattern won't stay a mere inconvenience. A society can survive poverty. It can survive inequality. It can survive even deep internal division. What it cannot survive, not indefinitely, is the slow erosion of institutional trust. The moment when citizens stop believing rules can protect them and start believing only connections, only status, only patient endurance can, that is when nations hollow out. Not in one dramatic moment, not in a single catastrophe or foreign invasion, but in a long, quiet unraveling. So gradual, but that by the time anyone notices, the foundations are already gone. It took 10 years to just wake up. And what are we doing after that waking up? Repeating it all over again, right from scratch. Not with a bang, with a whisper of resignation that becomes the loudest sound in the room. India has everything it needs to become one of the defining powers of the 21st century: the talent, the scale, the ambition, the democratic framework. But none of it matters if the operating system running underneath it all, the one installed 3,000 years ago, keeps corrupting every institution it touches. And if there's one small thing, this ancient invisible tolerance for hierarchy that cannot be challenged, isn't confronted soon, it won't just slow India's rise, it will destroy it. So, what do you think? Can India break the cycle that's been running for 3,000 years? Or is the weight of history simply overwhelming? Let me just touch on another topic, which is closely related to this mess that we have found ourselves into. And often that has left us wondering, how did we get here in the first place? It's about how individuals with limited knowledge often project so much confidence that even experts begin to doubt themselves. This is based on a mechanism called the Dunning-Kruger effect, as expounded by philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Incompetence creates a condition called a fool's paradise. There is a total lack of knowledge which prevents one from perceiving the complexities of a situation. Because that person cannot see the depth of a subject or circumstance or the gamut of the entire area of influence, it is likely to cover the mistakes through superficial information, as though he has understood everything, the whole thing. Many mistake more exposure to bombastic ideas like artificial intelligence, space technology, digital infrastructure, and so on. Reading from quotes or headlines on TV shows or newspapers or media. This is familiarity due to usage of terms, but where is the expertise? The ability to apply, test, and critically think over those ideas and so on. That is lacking. One should have a minimum of competence at least to recognize the genius of others, the excellence in others. Without this, the unskilled cannot distinguish between a genius and a mediocre performer. Instead of simplicity, some use jargon and complex, twisted, and turned to the extent of confusion of the language itself to hide a lack of understanding. When someone uses big words, jargon, or obscure concepts, listeners often assume that if something is hard to understand, it must be inherently brilliant or sophisticated. This allows individual to mask a lack of actual insight with a veneer of intellectual performance. Here I'm not in any way trying to demean the command that Shashi Tharoor has over the British English in particular. If you cannot explain a concept simply, it only means that you have not understood it well enough. Those trapped in the closed loop of ignorance often cannot be corrected because they lack the necessary capacity to process evidence that contradicts their fixed beliefs. Some people consume complex ideas with truly digesting them. They treat knowledge like food that hasn't been processed. So they have a functional grasp limitation of the underlying mechanism. Why is it nearly impossible to fix them? Because they cannot perceive the gap between their beliefs and reality. They cannot recognize that they are wrong in the first place. Arguing with them is like trying to send a fax to someone who doesn't know how to operate the fax machine. The message you send may be clear, but they lack the equipment to receive or process it. It's a manufacturing defect. Any evidence provided is simply reinterpreted through their existing flawed framework to protect their current certainty. Don't waste your energy trying to correct these individuals. Instead, spending such time on arguments often leads only to your own frustration. You cannot break their cycle from inside. They have locked the door from inside. And no amount of external evidence can penetrate that level of confident ignorance. Being confidently wrong is dangerous because it creates a closed loop of ignorance where the individual is structurally unable to receive correction. Because they cannot perceive the gap, they interpret any evidence or logical correction as mere disagreement or bias, which only serves to reinforce their existing errors. This state of structural blindness traps them as they have locked themselves into a framework that no amount of outside information can penetrate. So here we are in a chaos, blinded by power, hunger for power, greed for power, going to any extent to latch on to the power, blinded by the realities of the common man. The very roads you travel speaks of lack of petrol, which the common man is suffering. But the ways has been cleared just for the presence of this hierarchy or this adoration or idolation of an imagined entity of power. We are in a horrible mess. We have awakened, but have not yet gathered the courage and confidence to confront it in coordination and in togetherness. An individual cannot do it alone. We need to organize and get to work. The sooner we do, the better it is, not only for the country, but for us as individuals. We don't have time to lose. That's it.